Hey everybody, this is Aubrey Chavez from Faith Matters. As many of you know, at the beginning of May, the United States Supreme Court experienced an unprecedented leak of a draft opinion on the Dobbs versus Jackson case currently being adjudicated by the Supreme Court. The opinion was written by Justice Samuel Alito Jr., and if it ends up reflecting the court's decision due this month, it would overturn nearly 50 years of abortion law under the landmark Roe v. Wade case, which ruled that many then-current restrictions on abortion were unconstitutional and guaranteed nationwide access to abortion through the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy. Roe and the subsequent KCV Planned Parenthood have paved the ways for laws that in many states allowed abortion very late into pregnancy. Abortion is a really tricky topic, and it's a really sensitive one for people on all sides of this issue. But we feel like we have a duty as citizens to become educated on important matters like this, and our faith must have something to say on issues in which life and liberty and pursuit of happiness are at stake. Elder Oaks recently said, "On contested issues, we seek to moderate and unify." In that spirit, we explored this issue from a few angles, starting from a factual perspective, diving into the specifics of what's going on and what the practical stakes are, and then moving into what our faith might be asking of us as we seek to create a world that is just and equitable, one that honors both agency and life. I'm sure that we were not perfect at this as we navigated this territory, but we really did the best that we could to show respect to the values and the humanity that inform people of good faith on either side. This conversation comes in 2 parts. In the first, we spoke with Sharif Girgis, a professor at Notre Dame Law School, who also clerked for Justice Alito of the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as for our friend Thomas B. Griffith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. When we asked Judge Griffith who would be the most qualified voice that we could bring on the show, he unhesitatingly recommended Sherif. Sherif earned his JD at Yale Law School, where he served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal and is currently completing his PhD in philosophy at Princeton. Sharif helped us understand the current state of abortion law in the U.S., as well as what it could look like after the decision is made on Dobbs. After speaking with Sharif, we spoke with Latter-day Saint scholars Justin Collings and Jenet Erickson. We'll introduce them prior to their segment, but we'll humbly encourage you to listen through to the end. This conversation with Justin and Jenet led to some really spirit-filled practical takeaways for Latter-day Saints who want to be thoughtful, engaged, and loving on this issue. And with that, we'll jump right in. All right, well, to get started, I think it might be really helpful if you could just kind of talk about judicial philosophy and give us a little bit of context. So what do you see at play in Roe v. Wade and other relevant decisions? And then what do you see happening in this leaked draft opinion?
So Roe v. Wade infamously decided abortion policy for all 50 states without any clear grounding in constitutional text or history or structure or tradition. It was widely criticized for that, even by pro-choice legal scholars who favored the outcome, but thought that it wasn't required by the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say anything about abortion anywhere. Sometimes we do recognize unwritten rights if they're deeply rooted in our history and traditions, but at the time of Roe, 49 out of the 50 states had laws that were clearly contrary to Roe's holding. And as a matter of history, at the time that the 14th Amendment was ratified, which is the part of the Constitution Roe said it was interpreting, more than 3/4 of the states banned abortion at all stages. So there's no way that they thought there was a right to an abortion. So if there wasn't a grounding in text or history, there wasn't in precedent either. The precedents that the court relied on were pretty far afield. None of them involved anything like the arguable harm to a third party that abortion involves. And so it was widely seen as a kind of political act that displaced the policy judgments of the people.
Can you talk about where or how Roe v. Wade found the right to abortion in the 14th Amendment?
Yeah, it was a little bit vague on the exact basis. It said that some people point to the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, some point to some of the Bill of Rights, some of the rights in the Bill of Rights. On the 14th Amendment, the due process clause, so that's a clause that says, states can't deny anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. On its face, that sounds like it's just saying, we can't take away your life, we can't give you the death penalty or your liberty or your property, send you to jail or fine you, unless we have fair process, fair procedures. We let you know your charges, we give you a fair trial, we let you confront witnesses and so on. And but the court had held that even though that clause mostly focuses or explicitly focuses only on procedures, fair procedures for taking away your liberties that the clause prevents states from taking away at all, even with fair procedures. And it said that abortion, the right to access, to procure an abortion, is one of those liberties.
So there was a comment from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think decades after the ruling, where she called Roe v. Wade breathtaking. What did she mean by that? And was she indicating that there was some sort of seismic shift that had taken place in the role of the court?
Yeah, she was critical of how far Roe went and how fast. As I mentioned, 49 of the 50 states had laws on abortion that were clearly contrary to what Roe said the Constitution requires. So instead of, even if you favored the outcome of providing some abortion access, but Roe itself was so sweeping and so demanding. In particular, it said that until viability, and it had a bunch of details, but the crucial ones here are that until fetal viability, which happens around 22 to 24 weeks, which is when the fetus is able to live outside the womb, you can't ban abortion at all. And even after that, you have to provide for a health exception, which the court in a companion case defined really broadly to include emotional, psychological, financial, familial health, and so on. Which basically meant that if your doctor agreed, you had a right to an abortion at all stages of pregnancy. That's far more radical than almost any country in the world. Even now, just even looking at the viability line, that is farther along than almost any country. You know, the company we keep on that front include North Korea and China and just a handful of other countries. So it was extremely radical in its sweeping scope and in the speed with which it struck down the laws of so many states.
Wow. So can you talk about what the implication of the leaked opinion draft would be?
Yeah, so we don't know for sure exactly what will happen, but if we assume that there are 5 votes to join this opinion and that the opinion becomes the law, it stays basically as is, that would mean, it would not mean that abortion is banned across the country, as some people think. It would only mean that states are free to ban or permit abortions as they see fit. They're no longer required to allow abortion up to viability. So, you'll have California and New York doubling down on abortion access and maybe even using taxpayer dollars to fund them and maybe even to fund the travel of women outside of those states into the states to get abortions. You'll have places like Mississippi and Oklahoma being much more restrictive, banning abortion, maybe from conception, maybe from 6 or 8 or 10 or 15 weeks, with exceptions just for life or serious bodily injury. And then you'll have a bunch of states in between.
Now, on the draft opinion itself, is there any question about the authenticity or authorship of that document, or do we really know what that is?
The court has confirmed that that is an authentic document. It is a draft that was circulated to the whole court, to all the justices. What the court did not confirm is whether there have been later drafts or revisions to that draft, or for that matter, changes in the vote or otherwise. We have later leaks suggesting that there have not been further revisions circulated to the full court and that there are 5 justices, a majority, to join that opinion, but those haven't been confirmed by the court.
How do you think the leak is going, or do you think it will affect the decision at all?
It's very hard to say. I would be surprised if it made any change. I think the court is extremely unlikely to have been unaware of the political blowback it would face from this decision. And I think that the blowback it does face is unlikely to change its mind because it doesn't want to look like it's caving into political pressure.
Now, where do we stand in terms of the court's ability to legislate, and has that changed over time? And in 2022, obviously, I think constitutionally people are generally aware that legislating should fall to the legislature, but it seems, at least from my perspective as a fairly young person, increasingly that the court does seem to have the power to make sweeping changes that in other cases, and maybe that's starting with Roe v. Wade, that according to my high school civics class, may have been left to the legislature.
Yeah, probably from about the 50s and 60s, the court became much more vigorous in creating or recognizing individual constitutional rights, which have the implication of invalidating lots of state laws and federal laws for that matter. And the trend seems to be increasing on that front. It seems to be that the court has more and more power or claims to itself, arrogates to itself more and more power to make huge policy choices in the form of invalidating or upholding state regulations. So it's got a big case on affirmative action coming next term. It has dealt with abortion, gun rights, and a bunch of other big picture issues. And, officially as a constitutional matter, as you point out, it doesn't have lawmaking authority. It only has the authority to decide cases and controversies, which are disputes between particular parties about particular issues. In the course of deciding disputes, it has to decide if a particular law that one party is seeking to apply to the other party is unconstitutional because it's inconsistent with the Constitution, which is higher law. And that's officially where its power of judicial review of state regulations comes from. But a lot of people think that power has been abused, and that the court, even in cases where the Constitution doesn't support the outcome, or at least doesn't clearly support the outcome, is overriding the judgments of the people.
Understand. Could you walk through the logic of the Alito draft opinion and how it sort of does its work to undo Roe v. Wade, essentially?
Yeah, the opinion is pretty straightforward in the sense that if you had to predict what an opinion overturning Roe would have looked like before the leak happened, you'd guess basically this. First, it says that the Constitution doesn't explicitly protect a right to abortion. Then it says that we do recognize some unwritten constitutional rights, but in order to limit that, the claimed rights have to be deeply rooted in our history and traditions. You can't just have judges deciding what they think should be recognized as a right. They need to be able to point to a deep tradition in our history of recognizing that right. And then, so the opinion looks to whether there is such a deeply rooted tradition on abortion, and it notes that there isn't. First, at the common law, which is the law that was created by, English and then colonial and then state courts, abortion was treated as a lawless act at all stages of pregnancy. Then by the decades leading up to the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the part of the Constitution that Roe is officially interpreting, the court, more than 3/4 of the states came to pass statutes banning abortion at all stages, with very narrow exceptions for life or serious bodily health. And then and so between that common law history and the statutes and the absence of any treatises or even academic articles or anything else until just before Roe saying that there's a right to an abortion, the court concludes there is no deeply rooted tradition. So if it's not in the text, it's not in the tradition. And then the court says the precedents that Roe relied on were pretty far afield, so it's not in precedent, then there is no basis for it. And so the court concludes that any regulation of abortion is subject only to what our law calls rational basis review, which just means it will be upheld as long as there's a legitimate goal behind it. And in this case, legitimate goals can include the protection of prenatal life at all stages, the protection of the medical profession from the integrity of the medical profession, the health of women against these procedures, and so on.
So what do you say? I mean, is that the argument for, I just feel like someone could look at our history and say, we were racist, according to our laws, and we've been oppressive. And so, what do you say to someone who says this is how we have to evolve? Like we can't just always look at our history for justification for our laws. Is it just that there has to be this clear rationality? Would that be the pushback?
Yeah, so our history does include as well the amendments, the 14th Amendment and others that overcame a lot of that sordid history, a lot of those racial and other injustices. But the point here is that, it's not a question about what's the best policy, morally speaking. The question is who has the authority to decide? And everything that the court says in Dobbs would leave open to states to allow abortion, to the federal government, to Congress to override state laws banning abortion, and certainly it would leave it open to the people and their representatives to ratify a new amendment that guaranteed abortion access. So, if people think that that's what justice requires, that avenue is open to them. The deeply rooted in history test for recognizing an unenumerated right is a way to make sure that judges don't make law based on their own policy judgments, that we don't short circuit the extremely onerous process of passing a federal law or state laws or of ratifying a new amendment by just having 5 judges in place who create the policy that we prefer. The way they tie their hands is to say, look, we're not going to recognize it unless there's an objective tradition out there of treating this as a right. But if the people haven't done that either implicitly through historical protections for the right or explicitly through an amendment, it's not for us to say that the right should be recognized.
Thank you so much, Sherif. This is so helpful for kind of setting up the context.
It really
Absolutely.
has been. Thank you, Sharif.
Thanks for having me do it.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Next, we're going to jump into our conversation with Justin Collings and Jenet Erickson. Justin Collings is an Associate Dean for Faculty and Curriculum at BYU and a professor at the J. Reuben Clark School of Law at BYU, where he's been since 2013. He's a scholar of constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and constitutional history, and received his law degree and his PhD in history both from Yale. Jenet Erickson is an associate professor in the Department of Church History and Doctrine in BYU Religious Education. Her research has focused on maternal and child well-being in the context of work and family life, as well as the distinct contributions of mothers and fathers in children's development. She is a research fellow of both the Wheatley Institution and the Institution for Family Studies, and has been a columnist on family issues for the Deseret News since 2013. Justin and Jenet brought this conversation home in terms of what it means to be Latter-day Saints. We found them incredibly insightful and empathetic, and they helped us see this issue in new ways. We think they'll do the same for you, and we're deeply grateful to them for coming on. We'll head over to that conversation now.
This discussion reminds me of some research that David Brooks has shared, and I think he's even written about, where he talked about there was some sort of survey done among students, asking them, and it just asked them, among other things, when was the last time they encountered a moral dilemma and could they describe it? And a lot of the students, the majority of them, came back with situations like, well, I didn't know if I should pay the parking meter when I parked. And he was driven crazy about this because he said, that's not a moral dilemma. That's just right and wrong. A moral dilemma is when there are competing goods, on both sides, and you need to choose which is the higher good. And the U.S. maybe has said, no, only one side has a valid good to take care of here. So with that in mind, Jenet, I wonder if we could turn to you and sort of, I know your research probably has a lot to say about this, but I would love to start to explore what's really at stake in this debate for families, for women, for children, for society. Like, what are you seeing and thinking about as you work through this issue?
Yeah, it's so important to talk about. So thank you, Tim. Wonderful to hear. Justin, too. I think naturally, if we look at a pro-life perspective, right, we see that this life that is vulnerable is being, in terms of abortion, just discarded, as you described. If we look at the pro-choice side, we can see how a woman's autonomy and her body matters and all of the implications. I think many would say, well, for a child to be born into a really difficult situation, is that doing good for a child, right? And so just questions, I think, about value and whose values, and to just really take those seriously. But one of the things that comes up, I think, is you'll hear strong, right, like this moral position, this moral high ground by people. I take the moral high ground of valuing the life of the child. And I'll hear people I respect very much say, I take the moral high ground of this woman having a right to make this decision that's going to have so many implications for her life.
Absolutely.
And part of my feeling has been, it would be so wonderful if we weren't, no one really wants abortion. No one is really, really excited about life being destroyed, whatever stage it is developmentally, right? And so the hard thing is just to uncover, rather than grappling with that debate and right, who's the moral high ground, is figuring out, how are we in a situation like this in the first place? Why are women in such a desperate situation that they are having to make a choice? And I think there's a wonderful woman who will write, she'll say, to choose to take life, right, to abort, is for a woman like being caught in a cage, and she is desperate to get out, right? It's not like you choose it because you want it. It's because you're in a desperate situation. And a lot of us feel, as we should, deep compassion for her, right? And the difficulty of this decision. But what abortion has done, and if I used a pro-life expression, abortion on demand, right, has done, is it's sort of masked us really looking at why are women in that situation in the first place, and really getting to the core of the issues that are resulting in this need for this destructive act, and really, really dealing with that. So in some ways, all those issues have been shoved down the funnel of abortion, right? Just get an abortion, take care of it with an abortion. And then we would say, well, that's liberation, right? But in a sense, what it's prevented us from doing is really liberating women by getting to the core of what is causing us to be in this really desperate situation in the first place. So I love how Kathy Eden, who's a wonderful scholar, went as an ethnographer, lived in Philadelphia for 3 years, and interviewed low-income women to just find out what is going on in their lives. She did the same with fathers, later with men. And the question was, why are women still having children in these very difficult situations when presumably they can access contraception? I mean, there's a lot of efforts in the inner city to make that available, and to have abortion clinics nearby. And we know that having life is going to derail their futures, she would say, right? Having a child is going to preclude them from going to college and other opportunities. Why are they making this decision? And what she found is just tremendous relational poverty, what she would call relational poverty. These are women who'd grown up in very difficult situations. Many of them had not ever seen an intact marriage. They'd never seen like a stable marital relationship. They became involved with men, the men who were their friends and around them, many of whom were dealing with drug addictions, incarceration potentially, right? And the women themselves. And so they're involved in these with these men sexually, as would happen. And they're not using contraception consistently. She's trying to figure out why. And they would say, I'm not sure, I don't want to have a baby with him. And as she's digging deeper, there was this hunger for stable relationships that were connected, that were long-term, that were meaningful. She wanted it with that man, but that wasn't always possible for a host of reasons that we listed. And maybe a baby would secure that. Now, maybe she gets pregnant because she's not consistently using contraception. She's facing this decision of what it means to actually have life. And then abortion becomes an attractive option, or not, or she chooses to have that life. I think what it elucidates is there is so much underneath here that we need to unpack. And the hearts, when I read their stories, right, I think I want to get at healing that world that they are in with such tremendous relational poverty. And abortion, in a sense, is a statement that it's a right to breaking relationships. Now, I understand why it would be compelling, but in the long term, that is not what we need. In a world where we are starving because of relational fragmentation and breaking apart, we need to look into how can we heal relational connections. Many of these women aspire to marriage. That's what they yearn for. They see that as the white picket fence dream that every woman has, and men too, and have no idea how to get it. And so the hard thing is that when we see abortion as liberating, which you can feel deep compassion for women in that situation and for the potential life and what their life is going to be like. But to get to the real root of what those needs are, it's not going to be disassociation rights. It's going to be finding ways to heal connection.
Yeah.
With all that means, sexuality, poverty, addiction, infidelity is a massive issue. And I think all of that really says we've got to look a whole lot more at sexuality and how women and men experience equality in that, what healthy sexuality looks like, what relational sexuality looks like.
Yeah.
Not this broken out of its, right?
Yeah. So I'm curious. That is so interesting. I feel like you just said that so well, and that makes so much sense to me. This honestly, personally, this really is something that I feel like I'm still forming an opinion about. I feel like I can sense that there is so much I don't understand about this issue, and I think a lot of it has to do with privilege, like my privilege. And so I really appreciate that perspective. But I'm curious, for someone who says like, well, we are broken, like maybe in a deeper way than we even realized. Are you saying that abortion the right to an abortion would actually inhibit that healing? Or I mean, what do you say to someone who says this is the medicine? Like, we need this so that we can free these women to heal.
Right. Okay. And if we thought about that, it seems like a solution in the sense that in the immediacy of it, right, in what's imminent in her life, like this helps her. But if we look at it in the context of all that's going on, we can see how it actually precludes us. It's a barrier to really addressing so much that's causing this incredible vulnerability and desperate situation in the first place. And that is what's painful for me about Roe. It has kept us from addressing those things because it became a solution that was a barrier to actually looking deeper into what are the issues that are really at play here. And I think it's based on the idea, right, that sexuality was really stripped away from procreation. So you have children, procreation, sexuality, all torn apart. And this idea that, well, I have a right to act sexually. And here, in a sense, women were saying, I'm saying elitist women were saying, well, now we can be like a man who could engage sexually without any repercussions. And so now with abortion and contraception, I can do the same thing. But it ignores a tremendous reality, which is there is inherently a sexual asymmetry between men and women. The implications of sexual relations for her are going to be very different than for him. And we have not respected that. We've ignored it. And abortion has kept us, in a sense, in a place where we could ignore it. And that isn't liberating for women.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. I think that's one of the strongest arguments I've seen from the pro-choice side is that, say we suddenly begin to live in a world where Roe is overturned and these new laws come into effect that are essentially banning abortion. It's really not too much of a stretch to see that state of the world as somewhat inherently misogynistic because women bear such a greater burden. Perhaps you could call it an undue burden compared to men who, at least as I understand it, bear no legal responsibility, even though their actual act in causing this procreation was essentially equal to that of women.
Yes.
Is that right, Justin? Is that the current state of the law?
The trigger law?
Or just that men don't have, men truly don't bear responsibility?
Well, I'm not sure if there's the law in the books and there's the law in practice. Yeah. And I think that that might describe the law in the books some places. I think unfortunately it describes the law in practice to a large extent. And I think the further you go down the socioeconomic ladder, the more fully that describes the way that things work. Amazingly, almost at the same time that the U.S. Supreme Court decided Casey, the German Constitutional Court decided its second major abortion case, which was in the aftermath of reunification. And East Germany had very permissive abortion laws, and they had now acceded to the German Constitution. And so what are you going to do? What's the abortion law for a united Germany going to be like? And Parliament came up with something of a compromise, which was challenged before the Constitutional Court, because every important law in Germany, like every important law in the United States, becomes a constitutional controversy. And the Constitutional Court mostly reaffirmed what it had said in 1975. It reaffirmed this baseline that as a matter of principle, as a matter of constitutional principle, the state had to be pro-life, and abortion had to be in principle illegal with various exceptions. But one of the things the court also said was that that being so, well, not just that being so, but the state's duty to protect life included a duty to care for mothers of new infants, right? So that you can't just ban abortion at the front end, you have to provide support at the back end, which I think for a lot of people who self-identify as pro-choice is one of the reasons that they do, is that you can't just throw women to the wolves. You can't just require them to absorb this huge cost, especially when there's not a corresponding burden for the fathers of these children. But I think those who self-identify as pro-life need to come to grips with that claim and say, okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to support? I mean, pro-life has to mean more than banning abortions, because that's an anti-position, right? So there has to be something that's affirmative, and I think we could embrace the value of equality in promoting that. So, okay, if the problem that leads to abortion is broken lives, and the problem of its absence is also broken lives, well, what can we do to fix these lives at both ends? Yes. How can we promote life at both ends and flourishing and meaningful flourishing, right? Not just a nominal equality, but something that really meets needs.
That makes sense. And so, Jenet, in your study or work, have you explored ideas about what responsibilities either the state should have caring for women in this type of situation? Again, in a world that may come to pass where states are banning most abortions, or responsibilities that men may have that they don't currently. And like, what could a world look like that is truly equitable and one that is limiting abortion much more than it is currently?
Yeah. Tim, when you were asking originally this question, and I love talking about this, I was reminded of it's interesting that our early suffragists, our early feminists actually saw abortion as very indicative of oppression of women, interestingly.
Really? Oh, interesting.
And I think because the feeling was life was precious, and to put a woman in a situation where she had to take life was clearly an indication that men were not in a place of responsibility, and that she was in a place of significant oppression. So you'll hear this mantra at that time: votes for women, chastity for men.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that interesting?
That's really interesting.
And so the idea was, for a truly equal world, men also need to be brought to this level of honoring intentionally the way life comes about, honoring procreation by respecting it before marriage and after marriage, where we kind of took a different take, right, in the 1960s, where it was liberation looked like I was going to become like a man instead of a man becoming more like a woman in his honoring of life. And isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So I think they understood at that time what this equality might look like. Now, they dealt with marital rape. There's no question. They dealt with the fact that men controlled women sexually. And so all of that has to be healed, right? And in favor of women, if you will, right? Women being respected, and bodies and the way they act sexually being respected within marriage, outside of marriage, all of that. The thing is that abortion has not strengthened that. We've only seen it diminish, right? So so I think obviously those cultural things have got to be addressed. We cannot just overturn Roe and say abortion's gone and think we are healing what's really at the root, as Justin said, unless we are really getting at these cultural critical things. And we can do more in the church in terms of sexuality, a lot more, right? To really understand men, women, the sexual asymmetry, respect for ourselves, respect for one another. But then you asked too about kind of the economic side, right? The policy side. And I think to Justin's point, when we're conservative, we can be pretty libertarian about things and just say, take care of yourself. And this is really an important moment for the pro-life movement, I think, to say, what does really being pro-life mean? What does flourishing look like? And what responsibilities do we have to facilitate that? And that means, I think, thinking about, I'll comment sometimes on different policies, but it's interesting, in the low income community, they prefer policies that allow them access to money where they can make decisions for themselves. So for example, having the child tax credit be transferred into monthly payments. Mm-hmm. And of course, those are just examples of a child-centered culture. It's very interesting that a study was just done looking at how much money is spent on different age groups. And children, the budget for children is like 12%. And there's reasons, right? Because adults are caring for children. But it's just indicative of a culture that isn't oriented financially around children. And so there's something to be said for, if we want to be a pro-life culture, we've got to orient our money, our policies in a way that's really about the health and well-being of children. And if we're doing that, we're strengthening women in decisions around life. And if we're having an understanding of sexuality, and I think there is some of that. It's interesting that Guttmacher, that's a very strong pro-choice, right?
Yeah.
Organization just recently, they've been working on projects where helping men who are involved sexually with women actually be part of contraception decisions. I think in the mantra of my body, my choice, what we didn't know the fallout would be is, well, she's going to bear all the responsibility for everything, including acting destructively on her own life if things don't go as they had planned. And so I think recognizing, even from a pro-choice perspective, we've got to draw men in to this sexual decision-making and the implications that it has. And men need to understand what contraception is, be responsible for its use, right? And what it means for her body and all of those other pieces. So I think there's just pro-child, pro-male, female understanding sexuality. All of that has to be part of this cultural healing.
Yeah.
That leaves us in a place where we can really address things not destructively.
It's so useful to just have that paradigm moving forward, that like we start with this very natural asymmetry, and like that's the problem we're always going to be coming back to. Like we have to fix that. There will always be asymmetry there.
We can't do it. That is what is.
Yeah,
right?
That's the yeah. That's really
not
really
something
helpful
to deny, right? We can't just deny that. I think we sort of just pretended, right,
Mm-hmm.
that there is not asymmetry there, that we can mask it somehow, and it's only enhanced. It's only in a sense entrenched inequality in that realm.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So are there movements, are there factions of the pro-life movement that see this and that are really committed to real equality? Because I think that's obviously the criticism that pro-life that the pro-life position is under always, that there's no equality, that like this is the oppressive position. So are there people who are talking about this and like places to find more information, and does it have a name?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was actually drawn into an amicus brief on this issue, signed on, and it's a group that addresses this whole reality of sexual asymmetry. And the response was to Casey. And it's interesting. Here's Justice Ginsburg, a wonderful leader for women, if you will, right? Did some wonderful things. And in this decision, the statement is made, women depend on abortion to be equal with men. Now, if I just take that statement and you just unpack what abortion itself means, which is that she acts destructively on her own body and life, if I put it that way, then it's kind of a hard culture if women, in order to be equal to men, have to depend on that. And so I think they were responding by looking in terms of this amicus brief, by just kind of tackling that. Is that true? Do women depend on abortion in order to be equal with men? And I think exposing that's not actually real, right? That in some ways we've increased the feminization of poverty for women through abortion because men are not in the picture. It's strengthened we've seen it increase from 5% of out of wedlock childbearing to 41% today. And that is the cause of poverty in the broad culture. And so if you just think what we've done in rupturing that procreation and marriage and sexuality, it's really led to some pretty significant challenges for women. And so to say we depend on abortion to be equal, they're just unpacking that's not actually what we're seeing. And
Wow.
I would love for you to respond to this idea that, so I guess I want to kind of shift the conversation to theology a little bit, because I think that's usually where this conversation goes. Like when is there a spirit? Like when is this fetus a child? And it seems like if you're looking at polls, that religious people are generally a lot more uncomfortable with the idea of abortion. So it feels like the theology must be playing some sort of role in both of these positions. So I would love to hear what you think about. Maybe let's just start there, and then we can move on. How do you see theology playing out in this issue?
Yeah,
in the church and and maybe just broadly.
Justin, do you want to?
Sure. So I guess I'd start by trying to resist the notion that there's something fundamentally religious about the pro-life position. I think that the causal mechanism might actually run the other way, which is that secularism has been profoundly pro-choice for a long time. And I think people are those just get kind of lumped together in people's mind. I don't personally think that one has to believe that the unborn child or the fetus has a soul in order to be troubled by abortion. I think what's immediately troubling for me, for lots of people, is that it has eyes and ears and a heart and fingers, right? That's the more visceral. I mean, the most effective pro-life tracts are pictures of infants, not
no words at all, just
not
images.
sermons about. So it's an image, right? So I think it was Caitlin Flanagan said it takes a lot of words to defend abortion, but the argument against it is just a picture. That said, I think our own theological position is an interesting one. It does depart from the sanctity of life. We do believe that life is sacred and needs to be protected. We also believe in the pre-mortality of the soul, and think that at some point prior to birth, body and soul come together. But we don't actually, as far as I know, have any revealed statement about when that is. But the belief that we're created in the image of God and that life is sacred puts us mostly in the pro-life camp. There, we acknowledge some truly exceptional exceptions that make some others in the pro-life camp very uncomfortable, and some think that our position's not coherent. But I think what makes it coherent, at least for me, is the doctrine of agency, which is central to our understanding of the sanctity of life and the premortality of the soul. And this is what the principle that brings all those things together. And I remember then Elder Oakes saying that our opposition to abortion is not, in almost all cases, is not driven by some revealed notion of when body and soul come together, but by the doctrine of agency. I mean, we are pro-choice in the sense that we do believe that people need to be able to make choices about procreation. We just think that the choice to procreate is the choice to engage in procreative acts, right? That's when you exercise that choice, not later on when the consequences of those actions come into play and there's another life to be respected. Yeah.
So is that the response to to this idea that no one could ask you to sacrifice your body to save a life? Like you could never, we would never stand for legislation that demanded that we give a kidney because someone needs a kidney, or that we give blood even, or plasma, or even after we die, like you have to sign that you'd like to be a donor. So for someone who also it feels so committed to agency that's the part that feels broken to them, that they're feeling like they're forced to use their body to save a life. How do you use this paradigm of agency to respond to that?
I thought beforehand I would let Jenet answer all the hard questions, but
I was still staring at you.
You're just looking at me. So, I mean, it's a very difficult question, right? And this isn't ever going to be really an existential challenge for me, and so I speak with some humility on it, I hope. But the exceptions that church doctrine and policy recognize are exceptions where there really wasn't agency in the choice, in cases of rape or incest, or when competent medical authority recognizes that there's a serious threat to the life or health of the expectant woman. Those are cases where we say you didn't make a choice, and it is an undue burden in some cosmic sense to say that you must go through with this pregnancy, or you must sacrifice your own life to make this happen. At the same time, the law imposes burdens on parents all the time, right? And once children are born, there's high support for laws that require parents to take care of their children, right? And most people are in favor of neglect laws that so I don't see that there's necessarily a difference in kind.
Okay.
There, I mean, it's a unique circumstance, And I'm not the one to speak about the unique difficulties of childbearing, but based on observation and nobody says that this is a delightful experience to carry a child for physically, right? Then there might be emotional compensations, and we understand that it's a sacrifice that you're asking people to make, but we're asking it of people who did exercise agency, and we ask sacrifices of people all the time. Now, should we alter that? Should we make men sacrifice more? I think those are valid questions. I think the answer is probably yes, and what the exact permutations are is an interesting question. And to your earlier question about is there a movement afoot, right, to require more of this? I would say the answer is probably yes, but it's an immature, underdeveloped movement, in part because it was not an option, right? Abortion, until the point of viability, has been the constitutional law of the land for 50 years. And so I think that's bred complacency on both sides, saying, whether you celebrate it or lament it, it's there, and we depend on this, we rely on this, and see it almost as an excuse from doing the hard work of saying, what should we really be doing? If you remove those constitutional limitations, say, okay, we aspire to be a just society, a fair society, a free society, a flourishing society. What should we do? Or what should the regime look like now that the constitutional straitjacket has been removed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anything else to add to that, Jenet?
Oh, I was just thinking, so powerful to think about the opportunity really to address this sexuality issue so that there is more intention, right, around sexual engagement that leads to life. But you're talking about cultures where sexual abuse is rampant, where infidelity is the norm, and there's so much healing around sexuality itself that I think actually abortion has precluded us from really addressing, that would really get to the core of some of those deep needs of women and men and children. And so I look forward to the possibility of addressing more of those things, kind of being pulled out from underneath the shadow of Roe.
Are there, let's say Roe is overturned. And so I imagine that at least in some states, there will be a lot of talk about this. In some states, maybe the trigger laws, including ours, go into effect, and this isn't a really heated conversation because it's legislated already. But could you, what caution would you give people? Like, I think there's a way that this could really break down and become, maybe we start legislating contraception, or it seems like there's an extreme on either end that could be really problematic. Yes. So how would you like to see people approach this if this becomes something that states are legislating?
I think you just to have increased polarization around this, right? Deeper entrenchment is not helpful. And that's what we risk right now, right? Is so we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and we're not actually going to even abide by the law or whatever it is, right? If you're to this or to that. And so we have got to be more whole. I think all of us share deep concern for women. We share deep concern for children. We share deep concern for relationship strength. We all want that. We live in a culture that the epidemic of loneliness is the most horrible thing we deal with, right? And so it feels like we've got to pull together around our shared desire to bring healing and relationship strength and address the needs of men and women and children, and not battle over, right? Not battle with one another, but come together and see, you care deeply about women. I do too. You care deeply about life. I do too. How can we do that together? Because you are right. We are at a crossroads moment. We do not want increased division around this. And that is the risky point that we're at. And so we can say, I know you care about women. I care about women too. Let's come together to figure out how to best address those needs.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Going back, and this is related, but going back to the quote that Aubrey brought up at the beginning of the conversation from Elder Oaks that says that we seek, on difficult issues, we seek to moderate and unify. What doctrinal or practical tools do we have as as members of the church to help accomplish that goal in society, especially, and I mean specifically and on an individual basis. If there is someone that is listening to this conversation and wants to follow that, I think, wise counsel from President Oaks, what can they actually do? How can they participate in such a way to bring people together?
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
I had one, and Justin will have wonderful, there's all those policy things we can work together on, but I love this statement. It's from Joseph F. Smith. He wrote it to his son on a mission. And he just makes this comment about, if you want to help someone come into truth, right, draw them into a new perspective, you don't start by tearing down their house. You build them a new one. And then they leave that torn down house and enter this new home. And so it feels like when someone is an advocate for abortion, then they are, because they don't see an alternative. They see desperate people in a desperate situation, and they don't see an alternative. And what we can do is offer alternatives, offer hopeful alternatives. So for example, I think adoption can be brought back on the table. So many yearning to have at a way later marriage rate. We have infertility challenges that are way increased, and desperate people who would love to adopt. That's been off the table to a large degree. And I remember when the New York law went into place recently with Governor Cuomo that was kind of extending abortion to up through the third trimester. At the same time, there was these interesting research that came out where women who had been given a diagnosis, a lethal diagnosis, this baby would not survive beyond birth or beyond, maybe that first day, 2 days. And these were the women that New York was kind of advocating for, right? Should they be required to carry life when they know this baby is going to die? And should they have to go to Colorado to get an abortion because New York doesn't allow it? And so you could hear these yearnings. And so this research is so interesting. They were looking at women who had gotten that diagnosis and made the decision to either carry that life up to term and give birth or abort. And I'm reading these findings and I can't help but tear up, because the women who chose to have life, and it wasn't for religious reason, it wasn't religious research. They just went in and interviewed them about what that experience was like to hold that baby for a couple of hours after birth, or 5 hours, 10 hours. And you just heard over and over again, those hours changed us. They were the deepest experiences of our lives. The love that we felt just holding this little person. And it was an alternative that was so beautiful. Now, not easy, right? But for them, these became transcendent connections that the pain of carrying that life was just so swallowed up in the joy of, and the value and the meaning of this soul. And so it's an alternative, right? Someone might not have ever heard that. And so rather than tearing down the house, I think it's this opportunity to say, let's see if there's a better way that actually addresses the deepest yearnings of the hearts of that mother and her relationships and the life within her, right?
Oh, thank you.
Justin?
I think we've got really rich resources as a people, including theological resources. And this might be a little scattered, but I'll try to describe some of them. So one is that we have a great sense of an experience in building community. We don't choose our congregations for the most part. We get randomly assorted by geography. Now, there's some self-sorting that's going on that might be depriving us of some of that blessing. But for the most part, we go to church with people who are very different from us. And one thing that I've worried about in the last couple decades is that some members of the church find self-sorting communities online. So I go online to gripe about my ward, which I think misses the point, right? The point is that you get there with people that are very different from you, and you work it out. And we've, for the most part, learned how to do that. And we're quite good at bringing disparate people together with a sense of covenant, of being a covenant community where we bear one another's burdens. And I think we can take that covenant and expand it, right? And say, I mean, this is this is an extended exercise in burden bearing, right? As a society, we need to do this. We also have a rich doctrine of all being children of God, and that being our primary identity. Right? So before we are Lamanites or Nephites or any other manner of ites, before we're pro-choice or pro-life, we're children of God, right? And we can see that in the people we're interacting with and act accordingly, and maybe try to move beyond some labels and say, look, I think, Jefferson said, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, right? And maybe it'd be too much to say we're all pro-life, we're all pro-choice, but at some level, nobody that I know wants to destroy life indiscriminately, and nobody that I know wants to deprive people of autonomy and freedom and choice, right? And the labels that imply otherwise are maybe not helpful. I think we can step back and say, look, I think whether Roe lives or doesn't, I think a voluntary massive reduction in the number of abortions in the country would be celebrated almost universally. Okay. So if that's a goal for all of us, right? And I think it's a goal for all of us that women are happier and flourishing. And we in the church want a society where we're of one heart and one mind and dwell in righteousness. And there are no poor among us, right? Relationally poor, fiscally poor, whatever. We don't want that. So if we can reduce the number of abortions and reduce the number of poor among us, that's something we're all trying for. Okay. And the question becomes, how do we do it? Right? How do we do that? We'll disagree about that, but it will be a lot more productive disagreement if we start there saying, okay,
this is our shared desire.
Yeah. It's to find those who are at the bottom, find themselves. I think it was Tom Griffith likes to quote this, was Mitch Daniels, who said that our first care must always be for those on the bottom of society's ladder and how we can help them climb. Right. And I think that's something that all of us share. And we think of those at the bottom as being pregnant women in desperate situation and those being the unborn as well. Right. And how can we help both groups climb?
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. It really does feel like there's so much common ground. It just, it does. It feels a lot more simple. So, and it is complicated, but I really appreciate the way you've helped see that everybody is, holding on to something that feels important, and so much of that we totally agree on. Yes. Any other final thoughts?
Earlier you asked if there were any cautions or concerns, and my big concern is that if Roe and Casey get overturned at the end of June, then that triggers a free-for-all of what I would call ideological grandstanding. On both sides, right? So we control this state legislature, and we are going to show our bona fides to the cause by adopting the most extreme
it's almost
legislation
hard to see how that is not going to happen. Unfortunately.
And I just really hope that we don't do that. I hope that as a nation, as states, we can see beyond that and say, well, we'll actually make society better. And I think for those of us that are in the pro-life camp, it's a chance to show our good faith, not by being really doctrinaire, but by saying we really are genuinely pro-life, all lives. And maybe that will spill over into some other issues as well, and we won't be quite as dogged in our insistence on everybody's right to have an AR-15 or whatever the issue might be. But we really need to be promoting all life, right?
And what you said, right? That's what people feel. Actually, it's interesting how it cannot be reflected sometimes in our political energies and polarization, but I think down inside everybody, that's what they really feel.
And it, like you said about, we're divided into these congregations by geography. Some part of the power in that, I think, is that it takes one person in a ward to talk like that. And that's the beautiful house that's built that everybody else can see. It's one person in that whole network who isn't grandstanding and who, is trying to be unified and is trying to moderate. And I really think that you have so much power as an individual to affect the culture of your ward, even if you're doing it on your own, because it just, if it resonates with someone, then it is contagious. It just spreads. So I think that's maybe something that we've got in our in our wheelhouse
in
too.
our favor too, right? That
Definitely
truth invites that
Yeah.
people to join.
And we know and need to remind ourselves that we're not being unfaithful to our doctrine. We've said this for years, right? President Hinckley was great at saying, you can connect with others and reach them without making any compromise of your doctrine. And so when President Oaks says, on contested issues, we seek to moderate and to unify, he's not at all saying that we dilute or abandon our principles. He's saying that is one of our principles, right? Together with all the others that we, I recently read Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He talks about Christ as the mediator. And he says we tend to think about that as Christ mediating our relationship with God. Bonhoeffer says that for the disciple, Christ mediates every relationship, everything and every person in your life. Your relationship with that person or thing needs to be mediated by your discipleship once you've accepted the call to be a discipleship. Right? So all of our interactions at this point need to be mediated by our discipleship to the Savior. And we don't get a pass from behaving with Christian compassion and charity because we're on the right side of a political issue, right? Part of our discipleship is to moderate and to unify and to be a peacemaker, not a peace finder, a peace wisher, but a peacemaker.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you both so much. This has been difficult ground to cover, and you've both done it so beautifully. And thank you for coming on and being vulnerable and sharing your voices. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us. It's an honor to be with you.
Yeah, such a privilege.
Honor to be with Jenet.
Such an honor to be with Justin. Both of you. So grateful for all your work. Thank you for seeking to bring unity.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Again, we want to give a huge and heartfelt thanks to our guests, Sharif Girgis, Jenet Erickson, and Justin Collings. We really hope that you found their insights as helpful as we did. And of course, we'll ask for your forgiveness for the missteps that we inevitably made as we worked our way through this difficult conversation. As always, if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. It really helps us to get the word out, and we read all of the reviews. Thanks for listening, and remember you can check out more at faithmatters.org.